Here's a thing that's true about Australia. 70% of this country is essentially uninhabitable. Not difficult, not remote, not challenging if you pack the right gear. Uninhabitable. It will kill you in ways that feel almost personal. Dehydration, heat stroke, getting lost in terrain so featureless that people have walked in circles for days without realising it. Spiders the size of your hand, snakes that don't need a reason. Silence so complete it starts to feel like a threat. And Australians looked at all of that, at this vast landscape that takes up most of their continent, and they said, yeah, let's make horror films about it. Not survival thrillers where someone clever figures it out, not adventure films where the land is the backdrop. Horror films. The kind where the Outback isn't the setting, it's the thing doing the killing. And that decision to look at where you live and see a monster says everything about this country that the tourism ads can't quite bring themselves to say. This show is about that decision and about more than a century of films that came out of it. My name's Matt Dolby, and this is Strange Country. Now, I should tell you what this show is. Put simply, it's a podcast about Australian and New Zealand horror cinema, which I understand is a sentence that has ended many a dinner party conversation. People hear horror and they think blood. They hear Australian and they think, I didn't know they made films. Then they hear podcast and they reach for their phone. And then there's me. A man whose age sits him comfortably in what doctors lovingly refer to as Sniper Alley, with strong opinions about films most people have never heard of, and a level of enthusiasm for said films that my friends describe as a lot. The world doesn't lack for people explaining things to audiences who didn't ask. I know this. I'm doing it anyway. Because horror is the most honest thing a country can ever make. It's where culture puts the stuff it can't say at a dinner table. The guilt, the fear, the history that didn't make the tourism brochure. Every country does it. America makes films about serial killers because America has a complicated relationship with men and guns. Britain makes ghost stories because Britain has a complicated relationship with its houses. And Japan makes films about things that come out of televisions. And I've watched enough of them to know that whatever Japan is working through, it's taking a while. But Australia, this vast, ancient, deeply strange country, has spent over a century making films about the land itself trying to kill you. And New Zealand, one of the most remote places in the world, has spent the same century making films about something quieter, and in some ways more frightening. About what happens when the things a modern country buries refuses to stay buried. Two countries, one ocean between them, completely different nightmares. So what are they afraid of? What are these films actually saying? What are two countries trying to confess through 100 years of horror that they can't quite admit in any other way? That's the show. It's going to be great. Probably. Welcome to Strange Country. Episode 1. Australia. The Outback. The most important character in a century of Australian horror. Ancient. Indifferent. And if these films are to be believed, and I think they are, aware. The question isn't why Australian filmmakers kept returning to it. The question is why they were so convinced it was watching them back. Australia's cinema is older than most people realise. The story of the Kelly Gang, made in 1906, is one of the earliest feature-length films ever made anywhere in the world. Australia didn't inherit a tradition, it helped invent one. And from almost the very beginning, the films that resonated, the ones that people actually turned up for, were the ones that understood something true about the landscape they were made in. Something that the official story of the country couldn't quite contain. The Kelly Gang film was about an outlaw who the land produced. A man the bush made. Sound familiar? But to understand why the horror films of the 70s and 80s hit differently, and why they landed with the force they did, you need to understand what Australia was doing in 1978. Because something broke open and it changed everything. To Britain, which it had fought 2 world wars for, and called home even from 12,000 miles away. To America, whose cultural output it consumed like a second atmosphere. To everywhere, really, except itself. The films it made were genre films, mostly, serviceable and competent, shot in a country that looked like nowhere else on Earth and somehow managed to look like everywhere else on Earth, because that's what the story demanded. In 1970, the government started funding films properly, the Australian Film Development Corporation. Real money for Australian stories, Australian voices and Australian locations shot like Australian locations, and not like someone's approximation of England. What came out of that was extraordinary. Picnic at Hanging Rock in 1975, when Peter Weir, pointing a camera at a rock formation in Victoria and making it feel like the most threatening place on Earth. Caddy, Sunday Too Far Away, The Getting of Wisdom, films that looked at Australia with something approaching real curiosity and found, underneath the light and the heat and the enormous distances, something that resisted easy framing. Picnic at Hanging Rock is the template for everything that follows. A group of schoolgirls vanish into a rock formation on Valentine's Day. The film never explains what happened to them. The rock offers nothing, it simply takes them. And Weir shoots it as though the landscape had its own interior life, something watching, something deliberate, something that predates every person in the frame by 100 million years. And that idea, the land as a presence, not just a place, is the seed for everything we're going to talk about today. Because here's the thing about Australia in the 1970s. It was a country in the middle of working out what it actually was. The White Australia policy had only just been dismantled. It was an official policy until 1973. The Vietnam War had split the country in ways it was still processing. And the land rights movement was beginning to force a conversation that white Australia had been very successfully avoiding for 200 years. What do you owe the people whose land you're standing on? What do you owe the land itself? Big questions. The kind that don't get answered in Parliament. The kind that find their way into art itself and specifically, as it turns out, into horror films about camping trips gone wrong. Across the Tasman, New Zealand was having its own version of this reckoning. The Maori land rights movement was accelerating. The 1975 Land March, 1,400 kilometres on foot from Te Hapua to Wellington, put the question of land and sovereignty in front of the entire country in a way it couldn't be ignored. New Zealand cinema was just finding its feet at the same moment Australia was finding its voice. And what New Zealand filmmakers kept circling, even when they weren't making horror, even when the film was ostensibly about something else entirely, was the same buried question. What does a country owe to the people it displaced? And what happens when that debt goes unpaid long enough? Australia's horror films answered that question by making the landscape the threat. New Zealand answered it differently, and we'll get into that properly next week. But it's worth knowing, before we break down 3 major films, that what was happening on Australian cinema in 1978 wasn't happening in isolation. 2 countries, 1 ocean apart, processing the same unresolved history through completely different nightmares. Right, Long Weekend. Long Weekend was released in March 1979, and it's not the most famous Australian horror film, and it's not the most violent. It doesn't have the most iconic villain or the most quoted line, but it has something rarer. It has thesis. Peter and Marcia are going on a camping trip. They are awful people. Not cartoon awful, recognisably awful. Peter runs over a kangaroo on the drive out and doesn't stop. Marcia deliberately destroys a bird's nest. They drink too much, they litter, and they play music too loud. They move through the natural world the way people do when they've never had to think about it, as though it belongs to them, as though it exists for their convenience, as though it would never occur to them to consider that the arrangement might not be mutual. Director Colin Eggleston and writer Everett de Roche didn't make them awful so you'd hate them. They made them awful so you'd recognise them. And they put them in the bush, and the bush responds. Not attacks, responds. And that's the distinction that makes Long Weekend remarkable. The landscape doesn't hunt the couple, it notices them. It registers their presence in a way an immune system registers a foreign body. Slowly, inexorably, without malice, which is somehow worse than malice. A dead dugong washes up on the beach and keeps moving closer. An eagle follows them. The trees sound different at night than they do in the day. Nothing announces itself. The bush simply adjusts. Now the sound design is doing half the work. During the day the bush is loud. Birds, insects, the ambient noise of a living ecosystem that is entirely indifferent to the two humans inside it. And at night it goes almost silent, and the silence is worse. It has a quality to it that Eggleston never quite explains, a sense that the usual transactions of the natural world have been suspended, because something is paying attention. There's a sequence near the end where Peter is trying to drive out and the road keeps changing. He's certain he knows where he's going. He's driven this route before, and the landscape simply disagrees. No supernatural event, no monster in the road, no moment you can point to and say, there, that's when it became a horror film. He just gets more lost, and the bush gets quieter. It's one of the great sequences in Australian cinema. A man alone in a car, completely certain of himself, being unmade by a landscape that has simply decided he doesn't know where he is. No jump scare, no monster, just the road and the trees and the growing realization that confidence is not the same thing as belonging. And in 1979, that image, a white Australian man, certain of his place in his own country, getting more lost the more convinced he is that he knows the way, was not an accident. Everett de Roche wrote screenplays the way people confess things they can't say out loud. Long Weekend is a horror film on the surface. Underneath, it is a film about what it means to move through land that has every reason to reject you. 27 years later, a different filmmaker looked at the same landscape and found the same thing. Greg McLean grew up in rural Victoria. He knew the Outback the way you know something that's always been there, not as a concept, but as a fact. The heat, the distances, the way a road can go from manageable to genuinely frightening in about 40 minutes if you take one wrong turn. Wolf Creek made approximately 28 million worldwide on a budget of around 1.4 million. It scared people in ways they hadn't expected, and it used a real event as its foundation. Ivan Milat, the backpacker murders. 7 young people killed in the Balanglo State Forest between 1989 and 1993. Milat was a road worker, and he knew the bush. He knew which roads didn't appear on maps. He understood, with certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime in it, that out there, distance is a weapon. McLean took that and built Mick Taylor. Mick Taylor is one of the great villains of horror cinema, and almost nobody outside Australia talks about him the way he deserves. He's funny, first of all, genuinely funny, in a way that makes you drop your guard exactly when you shouldn't. He appears like a gift, friendly, capable, Australian in a way that feels reassuring if you're a tourist who's been driving for 6 hours and needs help. And then he isn't. John Jarratt plays him, and the performance is extraordinary in a way that rarely gets acknowledged. There is no flip switch, no moment when the eyes go cold and you see the monster. The warmth and the violence exist in the same person at the same time, which means there was never a version of this encounter that was going to be okay. You just didn't know that yet. What McLean understood, the thing that separates Wolf Creek from 100 other slasher films, is that Mick Taylor is not an aberration. He is the product of this specific place, the isolation, the self-reliance that tips into contempt for anyone who can't match it, the certainty that out here, past a certain point, the rules of the city are just a story people tell themselves. McLean shoots the Outback with a kind of relentless beauty, wide skies, extraordinary light, the kind of landscapes that make you understand momentarily why someone would choose to live their entire life in it. And then Mick appears inside that landscape, and you realise the beauty was never comfort, it was context. The land that made him is the same land you've been admiring for the last 40 minutes. The Outback generates a specific kind of man. Wolf Creek just had the nerve to show you what that man looks like when the social contract stops applying, which it does, out there, past a certain point on a certain road. And then there's Razorback, which is, and I say this with complete affection, completely unhinged. The year is 1984. The director is Russell Mulcahy, who would go on to make Highlander, which tells you something about his relationship with subtlety. A giant feral pig the size of a small car is terrorizing the Australian outback. An American animal rights journalist arrives to investigate. Things go badly. That's it. That's the film. On paper it sounds like a B-movie. On screen, it is something else entirely. Mulcahy came out of music videos. He directed them for Duran Duran, Ultravox and many other acts. And he brought that grammar into Razorback. Quick cuts, extreme angles. A visual language built for maximum impact on minimum time. In a horror film set in the Australian outback, it creates something unexpected, a landscape that is simultaneously real and hallucinatory. A place you can look directly at and still not quite see. The light is too gold, too red, too much. The shadows are too deep. The outback in Razorback resists comprehension. And not because it's hiding anything, but because that's just what it is. The men who live out there are half feral. Jake Cullen, who lost his grandson to the pig and has organised his entire remaining life around killing it. The Benny brothers, who run the local pig processing plant with the cheerful lawlessness of people who have never once had to explain themselves to anyone. The outsider, American journalist Beth Winters, played by Judy Morris, is the film's calibration device. She's smart, capable, reasonable. She arrives with the confidence of someone who has reported from difficult places and knows how to handle herself. The Outback doesn't care. Her competence is irrelevant here. Razorback uses her not as a victim but as a measure. A functioning human being against whom the film demonstrates methodically that functioning is not a survival skill in this particular place. The pig is almost beside the point. What Razorback is actually about is what the land does to you when you stay in it long enough. It doesn't kill you, it changes you. It strips away the parts of you that belong to civilization and replaces them with something older and harder. Something that isn't comfortable in a room with other people. Something that has started to think like the place it lives in. Long Weekend's Outback responds. Wolf Creek's Outback generates. Razorback's Outback digests. It diminishes you slowly until what's left fits. 3 films, 3 directors, 3 different decades, and the same argument underneath all of them. None of them sat down and said, I'm going to make a film about colonial guilt. They sat down and said, I want to make a horror film set in Australia about the thing that scares me. And this is what came out. Australia is a country built on land that was taken. The people who took it never quite stopped knowing that. They just got very good at not saying it. Not in Parliament, not in the papers, not at the dinner table. The story they told themselves was about empty land and industrious settlers and the hard good work of making something from nothing. And the land, in these films, kept quietly, persistently, refusing that story. And that's what connects Long Weekend to Wolf Creek to Razorback across 3 decades. The landscape is not neutral. It has a position, and its position is that the people moving through it have not reckoned with what they owe. Said it in horror films instead. And here's what I think is genuinely interesting about this. From the other side of the Tasman, New Zealand was processing the same history and making completely different films. Where Australian horror kept saying the land will punish you, New Zealand horror was building towards something else entirely. Something about the things you bury and the fact that burial is not the same as gone. We'll get into that properly next week, but the contrast matters. Same colonial history, same unresolved debt, completely different nightmares. The films are the evidence. What they're afraid of is the subject, because horror is the most honest thing a country ever makes. Next week, New Zealand. Most people, when you say New Zealand horror cinema, immediately say Peter Jackson, bad taste, brain dead. A kid from Pukerewa Bay with a Super 8 camera and an extraordinary tolerance for fake blood. And yes, we're going there. Jackson is essential, and we will do him full justice. But here's the thing most people don't know. Peter Jackson didn't start New Zealand horror. He just made it impossible to ignore. New Zealand horror has roots. It has a tradition. And next week we're going to start pulling on that thread, beginning with the kid who grabbed it and ran so fast and so far that most people forgot anyone had been holding it before him. Long Weekend, Wolf Creek and Razorback are all in the vault at strangecountry.com.au. Trailers, streaming links, the full database. Go look. And if you find someone who hasn't seen Long Weekend, make them watch it. It's the kind of film that stays with you in ways you don't entirely expect. Strange Country. See you then.